I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. According to New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, we live in a decadent society. When you think of the word decadent, you're probably thinking lavish, immoral, wasteful, maybe even chocolate. But that's not exactly what Douthat means. What he means is a society that's prosperous, powerful, and stuck. Stuck in an economic rut, a creative rut, a political rut, a society that's running out of spiritual and intellectual energy. Today on the BreakPoint Podcast, John Stonestreet talks with Douthat about his new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. Here are John Stonestreet and New York Times columnist Ross Douthat.
Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. One of the guys that I try to read as much as possible is a New York Times op-ed columnist, Ross Douthat. I got a lot out of Ross's book, Bad Religion, which was published in 2012. It's got one of the best subtitles ever, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. And Ross has a new book out called The Decadent Society. And just honored to have Ross have you on the BreakPoint Podcast today.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Hey, I want to say, too, that one of the podcasts that I enjoy an awful lot is the one that you do called The Argument with other New York Times columnists as the kind of sole conservative voice there. And I think you illustrate well kind of clear thinking and also clear argumentation. So that's got to be a lot of fun to kind of be on the stage there with those guys and talk about whatever's happening and just kind of go at it. I think you guys do a great job.
I appreciate it, and it is a lot of fun. And sometimes people ask me, how is it being conservative op-ed columnist or a Christian op-ed columnist or something at a liberal and secular newspaper like the Times, as if they think that, people are always walking by my cell and poking me with sharp sticks or something like that. But in fact, if anyone listens to the podcast can hear, at least in the group of columnists we have, I think we have a really nice collegial atmosphere. And, I always feel privileged that I get to write for a readership that doesn't completely disagree with me, but certainly, leans more to the left than I do. I think writing for people who you disagree with is sort of the point of writing. So it's not always fun, but a lot of the time I enjoy it.
Well, certainly the New York Times not only fuels our BreakPoint commentaries today, but it has for years. Chuck Colson used to say that, he would read the New York Times every morning before breakfast, and it was purgatory for his crimes of Watergate. So that's what he used to say about it. I don't know if you've ever heard that joke.
I wasn't there yet, so no, it's a new one, but it's a very Catholic thing for him to say. So I appreciate it.
Oh, that's good. Oh, man, we're getting into all kinds of holes here. Well, I want to talk about The Decadent Society, brand new book, the subtitle again. You're great with subtitles, by the way. I don't know if this is you or your publisher, but, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. I mean, talk about a kind of, loaded title, much like your previous one. So, and let me just let you lay it out. What is a decadent society? What does it mean that we're the victims of our own success? And then we'll dig a little deeper.
Sure. So a decadent society, I think the easiest way to put it is that it's a society that's prosperous, powerful, and stuck, meaning that it's achieved great things, it's achieved great wealth and technological proficiency, and it doesn't know where it's going next. It's sort of lost a certain amount of confidence in its own mission, and it's starting to stagnate, and it's starting to repeat itself. Its arguments are going in circles. Its blockbuster motion pictures are all remakes of movies from the 1970s and 1980s, a trend that you might have noticed a little bit over the last 10 years or so. And it's a society that's not collapsing. I'm basically trying to distill what I think is this weird feeling that people in America and really the whole developed world right now have, where there's this sense of crisis and anxiety and, unhappiness with the state of things. And yet at the same time, the world's never been richer. Life expectancy is high overall, allowing for the impact of the opioid epidemic. And, you have a world where people can write books one day saying the liberal order is cracking up, and the next day people will write books saying no, you're just imagining things. Life has never been better, and it's only going to get better from here. And I think in that zone is where decadence lives. It's not the fall. It's not the collapse. It's the sense that we've lost possibilities, that our frontiers have closed, that the future isn't what we expected it to be, and we don't know where we're going next. And that's why that's why that subtitle, which I'll happily take credit for, it has the idea that you have to have succeeded at something to be decadent, right? A decadent society isn't a failed society. It's a society that's gone as far as it can go in a particular direction and now is sort of stuck with where it's at.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the bar of what's considered successful today is much lower than it has been in America's past, right? I mean, the definition of a great story or a great blockbuster, or, you compare that. I was, just finished watching the History Channel's new 3-part series on George Washington. And you talk about what success is in those terms versus what success is today. Is that a characteristic of a decadent society, that we kind of redefine, we lower the bar of success so that we can jump over it?
To some extent, yeah. But it also reflects the fact that we've already built all of these things, right?
Oh.
So George Washington gets to be the founder of the United States. He gets to be the guy who defines the office of the presidency. And over time, most of our great presidents have done something similar, have effectively redefined some aspect of the American creed in the case of Lincoln, or have redefined the role of government or our constitutional system in the case of figures like Franklin Roosevelt and later Ronald Reagan. And the challenge is, after you've had these sort of heroic ages in your history, then your system starts to creak and it starts to break down a little bit, and you get gridlock and stalemate and sclerosis. And this affects both sides, right? This isn't just a liberal thing or a conservative thing. You can see it, when the Tea Party swept to power, right? After the first couple of years of Obama's presidency, there was this sense, they were literally dressing as George Washington at protest rallies, wearing tricorn hats. And there was this idea that, we're going to reclaim our original Constitution that's been sort of buried under bureaucracy and big government and spending and so on. But the truth is that Americans are accustomed to that bureaucracy and that big spending. This is sort of the world we have and the world that we've built. And it's much, much harder to change it once it exists in some form than it is to found something in the first place. And the same goes for liberals, right? Obama passes a healthcare bill that is, in a way, much smaller than anything FDR did or anything LBJ did. Obamacare was, nothing compared to the New Deal or the Great Society. And that was sort of the best that liberalism could do, because it had already built its whole welfare state. All it could do was sort of tack on this ungainly addition to the federal bureaucracy. And I think that applies a lot across a range of areas, right? I think I start the book with, the moment 50 years ago, which I think it's reasonable to see as one of the peaks of the American project, when we actually managed to send men to the surface of the moon. And I think there was this sense then that America was a country where the frontier was still open, right? Where we were going to go into space. Space was going to be the final frontier or the new frontier or the next frontier. And we were also a much younger society. If you watch, like Quentin Tarantino has this movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that came out this year, that's looking back on the movie industry in that same year as the moon landing. And if you watch it, what's striking is just how young America seems. Because the baby boom generation was just coming into their own. And now, 50 years later, well, it turned out space is awfully big and cold, and we can't get very far. And people have gotten older, and they've had fewer kids, and the country is older, and it's richer. It's not, again, things haven't fallen apart, but there isn't that sense of possibility, that sense that, a bunch of guys down in Houston and Florida can figure out how to throw a tin can up and land it on the moon.
Right. And to do it, in just kind of amazing ways. And I think, some people have, observed this. Maybe you have as well. That's kind of our last big cultural shared success or memory. You know what I mean? I mean, that was the last thing that all of America got behind, except for 9/11, which obviously was the exact opposite. It was not positive, it was negative. I mean, kind of the moon landing was the last thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, I have this idea in the book that I'm stealing from a couple of much more talented American historians called the technological sublime, which is the idea that in the modern age, but really especially in America, we've had these moments where some technological achievement has brought about a kind of almost metaphysical wonder at sort of the possibilities of what the human race can accomplish, and but that's also sort of linked to some sense, some religious sense, some sense of the universe as sort of an ordered and beautiful place that man has this permission to explore. And so you can go through them, the transcontinental railroads, the first steamships, the huge dams, Kitty Hawk, and actually flying. And from Kitty Hawk to the moon landing, right? It's like, 65 or 70 years. It's just incredible. And I think since the moon landing, we haven't had those moments. We've had 9/11, which is sort of I think I call it a black mass of the technological sublime, like, the dark mirror image. And then you've had these moments like when they flew the last space shuttle to be deposited in the Air and Space Museum in the Smithsonian, right? So they put it on a plane and fly it across the country, and people are looking up, and it's this shared moment of wonder. But what are we looking at? We're looking at the past. We're looking at something that we did and aren't doing anymore. And what remains instead is simulation. This is what we're now proficient at. So the iPhone is the great technological object of our age. And in a way, it has its own sort of tiny, perfect sublimity, but it's this thing that sucks you into it rather than being a thing that lets you go outward, across the country or the skies or to the very stars.
Yeah. My guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast is Ross Douthat, op-ed columnist at the New York Times, author of a new book called The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Success, talking about this idea of decadence. Ross, one of the things I found in Bad Religion, your previous book, and this one is just you have this kind of Malcolm Gladwell ability to kind of think differently, and I just think it's a really helpful thing. I always think better thoughts and just differently by reading your stuff, and this is one of those, because when people hear the word decadence, it's almost inevitably associated with collapse or decline. I mean, unless we're talking about desserts, right? I mean, that's different. But it's this moral unsustainability. But your second part of the book is making an argument that you can kind of exist as a decadent society for a while. Like there's actually a sustainability to this.
I think that decadence is a default state that a lot of successful societies end up in. And once they end up in it, they're vulnerable, right? It's not that they don't have sort of signs of decay or indicators of their own mortality. But in the absence of the right catalyst or the right external enemy, they can sort of go on being decadent for a long time. So just, to take some sort of historical examples, people think of the Roman Empire as falling into decadence with Nero or Caligula, some of the emperors from the first century who fiddled while Rome burned. Mm-hmm. And you could argue certainly the Roman Republic was gone by that point, and you could argue that after Augustus, decadence begins. But in fact, it's 400 years from Nero to what we think of as the fall of the Roman Empire. And you can tell similar stories, I think, about the Chinese Empire is decadent by the 17th century, and it doesn't collapse till the early 20th century. The Ottoman Empire sort of limps along as the sick man of Europe for a long time. And in our case, it's a little bit hard for me to see, and I spend a lot of time in the book sort of running through scenarios, who the external power is that's going to overthrow us, right? Because if you look at the other powers in the world, in many ways they seem to be converging with us. It's sort of the whole, we're a world civilization, and the whole world could be decadent and stable in that decadence for a long period of time, which is not, I'm not a prophet. This is not a guarantee. And I also spend some time in the book talking about catastrophic scenarios where the weaknesses inherent in our decadence could lead us to collapse. But I think it's useful in an age when people are obsessed with the idea of crisis to say, hey, this situation could go on for 50 years or 150 years or a surprisingly long time.
I hope you're enjoying John Stonestreet's conversation with Ross Douthat. We'll get right back to them in just a moment. Now's the time to register for our annual Wilberforce weekend, which takes place May 14th through 17th, just across the river from Washington, D.C. Come and join us as we honor Chinese Christian and pastor Bob Fu for his work on behalf of the persecuted church in China. You'll also meet and hear from Christian thought leaders like Os Guinness, Lee Strobel, Andy Crouch, Obianuju Ekioka, and more. Come to wilberforce.org for more details and to register. That's wilberforceweekend.org. Now back to John Stonestreet and Ross Douthat.
Yeah, I think we look back at kind of these historical periods of time, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the collapse of Rome, and we read it as if it happened overnight, but we're talking decades, even centuries. So where are we in the the time curve? I mean, how long have we been, in your words, decadent? I
mean, I start the story with the moon landing, and I think that's a reasonable place to start. I think you can see, starting in from the late 60s through the 1980s, you get the beginning of the acceleration of the four big trends that I associate with decadence. The first is economic growth slows down. It doesn't disappear, the economy doesn't collapse, people keep getting richer, but you don't have the kind of huge leaps that we associate with the Industrial Revolution or with the post-war American boom. So growth starts slowing around when Richard Nixon is president. Around the same time, you get demographic decline. After the baby boom, people all over the Western world, not just the Western world, all over the rich world, East Asia included, stop having babies. And this happens more slowly in America, but we've finally caught up over the last 10 years, and our birth rate is below replacement too. So you get demographic decline, which makes society older, which slows down economic growth, slows down technological innovation. And then you get political sclerosis. And this means just sort of what we see in D.C. right now, what we take for granted. Gridlock, stalemate, two parties that are polarized, but also different branches of government that can't fulfill their constitutional roles. And you have versions of this in Europe, too, where you have this stalemate between a European Union that kind of wants to be a United States of Europe, but can't quite get there, and national governments that don't want the EU to tell them what to do, but don't want to leave the EU either. So you have this stalemated politics. And I think all of those things are pretty much inarguable. The fourth case that I talk about is a little more in the eye of the beholder, which is cultural repetition. It's the idea that basically you have this sort of burst of creativity in really the 60s and 70s, where you have, the rise of rock and roll and this burst of pop music creativity. You have sort of the last golden age of Hollywood, basically around when the Godfather movies came out. And at a certain point over the generation after that, you just get much more and more repetition, more and more of pop culture turning to these franchises that were new and fresh when the baby boomers came of age, but are not new and fresh anymore. And then, this is complicated, and culture is it's obviously hard to pin down. But I think you can see that happening.
Oh yeah, I mean the repetition point is especially. I mean, how many sequels? Let's take the same story and change from a male lead to a female lead. Basically what the marketing pitch is we're going to take an old story and woke it, so that it's sufficiently inclusive.
Right. That's the latest. Yeah, that's the latest twist. And even before that, it's taking properties from the 60s and 70s and rebooting them, and then rebooting them again, right?
Yeah, right. And again, and again.
A figure like, I use the example of Star Wars because it's, I think, readily accessible, right? But the idea is that the first Star Wars movies are sort of a pastiche of a lot of golden age of Hollywood stuff, but they mix together a lot of different movies, a lot of different ideas and archetypes, and make something that, it's pop culture, but people love it. It's tremendous and different from anything else that's going on. Then 25 years later, George Lucas tries to do that again. If you go and watch his prequels, which I don't recommend doing, they're terrible movies, but they're movies where he's trying to do something different than he did the first time. He's trying to tell a more political story, a more tragic story, and it fails. He can't do it. He doesn't have the capacity. So then Star Wars under J.J. Abrams, who's sort of the prince of pop culture decadence, in my view, this sort of moderately talented guy who can imitate Steven Spielberg and George Lucas pretty well. He takes over, and the new Star Wars trilogy, it's just the same trilogy over again.
Oh, it's painful.
It starts in the same place, it ends in the same place, and in that sense, it's not terrible. Like, again, this is the thing. Decadence is not it's not that things stop being entertaining. They're just the same things over and over again.
So are there exceptions, right? So, I mean, many people have kind of looked at that. When a new band comes out that is legitimately different, it's almost like jaw-dropping, right? I mean, people kind of remember Dave Matthews or, something like that, which is so dramatically different. And it kind of sounds like, oh, we haven't really heard this before. That happens very rarely.
I mean, look, some of this is, I'm a child of the late 1990s. I was a teenager, in 1998. And I'm sure I'm biased in certain ways, but I do think that the late 1990s are this last flash of non-decadence, where you have the dot-com revolution, which in its first way was really a revolution before it just became Facebook and Twitter. It really, you have a real change in productivity statistics, which is the best economic measure of how technology is affecting the economy. People talk now, like automation is taking over, but productivity growth is slow, it's stagnant, it's mediocre. The last time it was good was in the late 1990s, and this was also the last peak for Hollywood. Like the movies that came out in 1999, from The Matrix to The Talented Mr. Ripley, there's this whole 15 really good movies in 1 year. So that to me was the last flash of non-decadence before economic and technological stagnation took over again, and pop culture was taken over by superhero movies, basically, from then on out. But even now, you would say you would have to say that Silicon Valley, as much as it partakes in decadence in various ways, is less decadent than the rest of the American economy. It is the one place that has real technological innovation, and they're on TV. Portions of what gets called the golden age of TV was genuinely creative and not decadent. And I'm not as much of a music person, but I'm sure there are aspects of pop music right now that are non-decadent. So it's not a comprehensive thing. It's not that under decadence you can't do something creative or you can't live fruitfully. But I mean, think about it in terms of fertility, right? Is it the case that in an age of demographic decline, nobody has large families? No, people still have large families. I'm Catholic. I know a lot of people with large families. But in general, they're exceptional and weird.
And we get looked at. Yeah, that's right. We get looked at as if, don't you know what causes that?
And it's the same way and it's the same way in other areas. You can have, politicians who are not decadent, but they're unusual, exceptional, and so on.
Yeah. And again, my guest today is Ross Douthat, New York Times op-ed columnist, author of the book, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. I'm really tempted, Ross, to really, we're just kind of hitting the end here, but I'm tempted to go down the reproductive rate, the procreation, sterility sort of chapter, because I think that ties in with what so many people have talked about in the past, that a society can't build if it doesn't think about the future. Nothing makes you think about the future than a culture in which kids are normal. And your comment about the iPhone turning us inside instead of outside, it makes me think of fur babies, where people are replacing babies with pets, which is completely different experience, but trying to get that kind of love and acceptance without all the kind of the future requirements, that babies come along with. But that would take us down a really fun, but I think too long rabbit hole. I want to get to the final part of the book.
It's not, fur babies are the benign part, right? The reality is that it's all about pornography in that zone. And what's interesting is that when hardcore pornography took off in the 70s and 80s, lots of social conservatives and feminists too said, look, this is going to create, a total social breakdown. You're going to have much more rape, much more sexual violence, it's going to be Ted Bundy's all the way down. And instead, obviously there's still rape and sexual violence, but what porn really seems to do is it causes erectile dysfunction. It causes this turn inward. In certain ways, it makes the world safer because men who might have been rapists are effectively drugged by pornography instead. But that's the dynamic. And that's the difference between decadence and collapse.
Yeah. That's a great point. That is a great point. Yeah, I just have a personal vendetta against fur babies, but your point is much better taken because that's the definition of sterility. It's separating something that by God's design was inherently life-giving and making it sterile. Well, let's get into part 3 because you talk about essentially 3 ways. I guess maybe one way to say 3 ways to get out of decadence or 3 ways to move on. I don't know if you call it the deaths of decadence, catastrophe, renaissance, and providence. So talk us through that.
Well, catastrophe is sort of the obvious thing, right? It's what people expect. And, something like the coronavirus, which had obviously not broken out before I started writing the book. If the world was swept by a virus that, had catastrophic effects and devastated supply chains and led to wars and famines and so on, the world would no longer be decadent. It would be a lot worse, right?
Right.
But that scenario is, I think, the one that people sort of at some level intuitively expect, that decadence goes on until something unexpected happens and the system, which was already creaking, suddenly breaks down. And what I talk about a bit more in that chapter is the combination of pressures from climate change, sort of warming in sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent, joined to population pressures, where you're going to have a world in 75 years where there are probably 4 billion Africans and 600 million Europeans.
Wow.
And if you put those together and you can get a mix of migration and climate changes, drought, famine, and so on, that could be dramatically destabilizing, but more likely to be destabilizing, I think, in the European part of the wealthy world than in the U.S. So that's sort of, examples of catastrophe. Renaissance, I sort of run through ways that the different trends we talked about earlier could end, right? So you have an age of economic stagnation and technological stagnation. Well, it could end if someone has some big breakthrough, some great leap forward in technology. And it could be that we're just in some kind of bottleneck where research that people are doing now is suddenly going to lead to radical life extension, or at the very least, self-driving cars and an energy revolution or something. So you could imagine something like that. You could imagine political revolutions that, I think you see on the right and the left in support for populism and support for Bernie Sanders, a desire for a more radical politics. And you could imagine, I think right now that has led sort of back to the same stalemates, but you could imagine something happening and suddenly you really do have major ideological change. And then I think the one that's obviously closest probably to both of our own hearts is the idea of religious revival, right? That, if the Roman Empire persisted for 400 years in decadence, that was also the era when Christianity took shape and eventually took over. And if you're thinking about things that could make people have children and be optimistic about the future and be artistically creative and all of these things, again, religion is the most, or one of the most powerful motivating forces. And I sort of end that chapter by saying, give away the whole book, I guess, but that there is, I think, an alchemy between science and religion that we've lost a bit, as religious people are skeptical of what the scientists are up to, and scientists think the religious people are ignorant fundamentalists. But if you look at these moments, whether it's, the Age of Enlightenment, Isaac Newton, the scientific revolution, or even the space program, you have this entanglement. I mean, the space program comes out of a world of optimistic American Protestant Christianity, where people are, reading Genesis while they orbit the Earth and taking communion on the moon. And I don't think it's unreasonable to imagine that some synthesis of, the scientific desire for knowing and the religious desire to know God might be what it takes to end decadence decisively.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see it coming from anywhere else. I mean, other than collapse, right? I mean, there's
always collapse.
There's always collapse. There's always
collapse.
There's always that dark lining on that silver cloud. But really, I mean, where else are we getting innovation? I mean, or that sort of hope? It's not coming in education. It's not coming out of the political process. All of the potential inventions that we can think of, again, are they really inventions that are going to turn us to higher thoughts, or are they going to turn us to more convenience and more, infinite choices or something like that? It's kind of hard to see it coming from anywhere else.
Yeah, pure consumerist virtual reality is sort of the dark technological future right now.
Right. So you gave us some societies, and we'll end here with this question. You gave us some societies that were kind of similar in terms of their decadence. As we look to what are historical examples of societies that have come out of it? I mean, is the birth of Christianity out of Rome, or not the birth, but the radical expansion and societal renovation that came out of the collapse of Rome? Is that a good example?
I mean, it's not ideal only because Rome did fall, right? So you had this.
There's that. I mean, other than that, other than that.
No, but I mean, it is an example in the sense that you have a new civilization, a transformed civilization emerging within a decadent older one. But it's not ideal in that Christianity, while it was able to preserve some of the best of Rome, did not prevent the collapse. You still had the collapse in the end. But it is an example. I mean, I sort of narrow a smaller example that's not imperfect because it's small, but if you look at what happened in Japan upon Japanese contact with European civilization, it was very different from what happened in China. China sort of persisted in decadence and was basically carved up by the European powers, but Japan, which had been closed and existing in its own kind of decadence under the shogunate for a long time, basically had a kind of dramatic political and cultural revolution that transformed the society, restored the emperor effectively in certain ways, and made Japan a world power. And again, not a perfect example because eventually Japan as world power became an aggressive military dictatorship, right? So I'm not, but it is an example of how a society can sort of awake to its own condition and transform more rapidly than you might have expected just from looking at it.
My guest today, the always intriguing Ross Douthat, op-ed columnist at the New York Times, author of a new book called The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. Ross, one of the things we talk about when we talk about Christian worldview is kind of a take on N.T. Wright's question, what time is it? Like, what moment are we in redemptive history, both culturally and cosmically? And that I think this book, for me, it's been again another way to kind of put our finger maybe on some very important details of our kind of cultural moment in a way that I hope will kind of shape a vision of what we believe is the restorative power of the gospel and of faith. So I thank you for the book. Thanks for the conversation today. Again, the book's called The Decadent Society by Ross Douthat. Ross, tell our folks too where they can follow you.
You can follow me on twitter.com, that wonderful website, at Douthat NYT, and my columns appear in the New York Times on Tuesdays and Sundays most weeks.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Ross. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, John. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Come to breakpoint.org and click on this podcast, and we'll tell you how you can get a copy of Ross Douthat's outstanding new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. And remember, please come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for our annual Wilberforce Weekend in May. It'll be a great weekend with powerful speakers. That's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.